welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Abu Dhabi, or Yas Marina, post-race reaction. The final race for the season. What was your thoughts on this race? Did you consider it boring, as there wasn't really an on-track fight for those podium positions? Did you think Leclerc on the tail of Lando gave you enough of a interest to keep it things, on edge and interesting whether Lando was going to fall back into the clutches, into that fourth position and lose the title? Did the midfield action, the passing and repassing, all the way through this, scenario, this race, keep you engaged? What about Max? Did you think Max messed up by not, backing up the field? Could Max back up the field? Was it too tricky with McLaren's on those split strategies that they went for? Or was there something else that Max could have done to potentially edged out a little bit more favor for him? What about Oscar? Did you think Oscar actually had a chance to win? Did you think Oscar should have pitted a little bit earlier than letting Max by? Or would you think that was just pushing it for that, safety car, the best thing to do? What about Lando? Did you really, like Lando holding out on that third position and winning the Drivers' Championship? I, for one, think it was a really good job from him. He did what he needed to do. He kind of played it out. Yes, he did lose that second position, which I was thinking he was going to fight for a little bit harder than he did, but he got into that third and kind of played it safe. I think he did a decent job with Charles Leclerc, keeping him behind, and then kind of playing it out. I know the team was kind of more on edge, I think, than Lando was with Charles Leclerc behind him, but he was able to end up pushing that out and getting a fairly decent gap from him and kind of playing it out for his favor and just staying in what he needed to do to get to that championship. He stayed calm and collective and not kind of lose track of that. So I think that all played into that factor. So overall, I think this was a pretty interesting race, even though it wasn't quite the normal race that we would want to see for the Drivers' Championship. I think it was interesting in the regard for all the other drivers, having that repass action in the back, and I think it had enough strategy involved that it kind of played out where, Max went a little bit longer than Lando did. And then Oscar going way long, starting off on those hard tires, totally different, aspect and strategy than, Max or Oscar, Max or Lando. And then Charles Leclerc coming into the mix with that two-stop, kind of putting some more pressure on, Lando, kind of gave it a little edge for me in that regard. But what was your thoughts on this? Did you enjoy it, or did you think it was a bore? Let me know in the comments. Just like normal, we go from the back of the pack and work my way to the front of the pack, going through each driver, telling you what happened to them if I know, and how well they did if I've seen enough of their broadcast, which some of these drivers I haven't. But we'll start off at the back with Franco Colapinto, who started off in 20th and ended up in 20th. He had a two-stop race, stopping on lap 15, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to lap 40 before switching to another set of mediums. He did get a black and white flag for track limits on lap 33. Now, his teammate, Pierre Gasly, started off in 19th and ended up in 19th. He also had a two-stop strategy, stopping on lap 13, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a nice 3.0 second pit stop. He took that hards to lap 40 again, switching to a set of mediums at that pit stop. He did pass Hulkenberg for 18th on lap 2. He did get a black and white flag for track limits on lap 31. And then he had a 5-second penalty for track limits on lap 46. So in general, I think the Alpines were kind of having a hard time in this circuit. In the last few circuits as well, I know they've kind of shifted over. And hopefully when they take on that Mercedes engine, which is supposed to be rumored to be one of the top-notch engines next year, that they'll kind of be able to, do something with that and get back into the, sway of things and be competing up there with the rest of the folks. But unfortunately for this race, I think they were kind of lagging behind. Started off pretty poorly in those qualifying session and ended up in those same positions. So it's not a good race for either of them, but I don't think it was necessarily their fault directly. I think it was more that car was not able to get dialed in and have the best performance at this race. Then we get to Liam Lawson, who started off in 13th and ended up in 18th. He gained 2 spots in the first lap, so he did a pretty good job there. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 21, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And that was a nice 8.9-second pit stop because of the penalty that he got for driving erratically on lap 14, which was the 5-second penalty. So that add that on there. So it's not horrible on that pit stop. He did pass Stroll for 5th on lap 18, passed Norris for 5th on lap 19, passed Stroll for 6th on lap 21, had a black and white flag for track limits on lap 23, and then passed Franco for 18th on lap 40. So with that 5-second penalty in there, that kind of threw him into the back of the field. So due to that, it kind of cost him this race, getting up there in the points, which was a shame because I think he was doing fairly decent before that. But that kind of erratic driving kind of cost him dearly, I think, in this. So that was his mistake, which kind of pushed him back in this field. His teammate Isaac Hydjar started off at 9th and ended up in 17th. He did gain one spot at the very first lap as well, so not as good as his teammate, but still, moving up forward. And he had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 14, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.6-second pit stop. So I'm not sure exactly what happened to Isaac Hydjar because he dropped back into the field quite a bit in this race and wasn't really able to compete in that running. So I'll have to go figure out what happened to him. Alexander Albon started off in 17th and ended up in 16th. He gained 2 spots at the very first lap, so a pretty good run from him on that very first lap, getting up there, getting a couple spots. He had a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 8, switching from a set of softs, so one of the few people that started off on soft tires, switching from those softs to a set of hards with a 2.1-second pit stop, taking that set of hards to lap 33 before switching to a set of mediums. He also had a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, which kind of hurt him on that very first run. So we had to take that into effect and dropped him back a little bit farther back in the grid than he wanted. So he needs to watch that pit limiter, and probably a mistake at the end whereby he's tired in that regard for the season. So hopefully that'll come together for him next year after this break. He did pass Behrman for 14th on lap 28, passed Lawson for 15th on lap 44, passed Hulkenberg for 16th on lap 50, passed Hadjar for 16th on lap 54, and got a black and white flag for track limits on lap 56, but didn't actually get a penalty for that track limit, so he's able to keep it within those boundaries for the rest of the race. So that was good to see. So overall, I think Albon, again, was doing a decent job, not a great job, but doing a decent job, except for that speeding in the pits, which cost him that 5 seconds, which dropped him back into the back of the pack, which kind of hurt him in that regard. So due to that personal error that he made in the pits, from my viewpoint, that kind of cost him. So due to that, he didn't really do that great in this race, even though the rest of his racing was decent in that regard. So you have to take that into effect compared to his teammate, which didn't get in the points either. So you have to kind of feel for those Williams drivers in that running. Kimi Antonelli started off in 14th and ended up in 15th. He did lose 3 spots at the first lap, so a pretty poor start for him getting in there. I'm not sure exactly what his line was or whatever happened, but he ended up losing 3 spots, so he needed to kind of be able to choose those positions better, I think. He's still a rookie, so that's kind of understandable in that regard. He'll learn some of that, and some of it's just luck, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But he did a one-stop race, stopping on lap 32, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums with a nice 2.6-second pit stop. He did get a black and white flag for track limits, which a lot of people did, on lap 31, and he didn't ever get a penalty for that, so that was good to see, keeping it within boundaries in that regard. He did pass Franco Colapinto for 18th on lap 40, passed Lawson for 16th on lap 42, and passed Isaac Hydjar for 13th on lap 48. Besides that, he just kind of dropped into that midsection and stayed in that midsection, not really gaining the positions back that he lost at the very beginning, which kind of hurt him in that regard, keeping him in that 15th position overall. Yuki Tsunoda started off in 10th and ended up in 14th. He did a one-stop race, stopping on lap 32, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums with a 7.9-second pit stop because of a penalty for changing more than one direction while defending. So that kind of hurt him in that regard, and that was kind of caused by Lando Norris's pass when he was defending on that, which I have a hard time seeing that it was really worth a 5-second penalty on that. I don't think he changed that position quite much. I think it would have been just a racing instant in my view and left him alone. But unfortunately, that gave him a 5-second penalty, which pushed him back into that back pack, which kind of hurt him overall after he was doing a little bit better. Not quite where his teammate was, but a little bit better overall in that Red Bull at the last couple of races. So I was kind of sad to see that him, ending his Red Bull career, getting dropped back down to that point. But he did pass Gasly for 15th on lap 40 and passed Hijar for 12th on lap 45. Carlos Sainz started off in 12th and ended up in 13th. He did lose one spot at the very first lap, so not the best start, not the worst start, but kind of losing that spot was not the greatest thing. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 18, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.7 second pit stop. He did pass Behrman for 12th on lap 2, passed Gasly for 18th on lap 19, and passed Hijar for 15th on lap 33. Oliver Behrman started off in 11th and ended up in 12th. He did lose one spot at the very first lap, so again, those starts need to be worked on a little bit, but still a decent run from him, I think, overall, except for the penalty that he got at the very end. He did a one-stop race, stopping on lap 14, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 3.0 second pit stop. He did pass Sainz for 12th on lap 2, passed Hamilton for 12th on lap 4, passed Hijar for 15th on lap 25, passed Albon for 14th on lap 28, passed Hülkenberg for 10th on lap 34, and then he got that 5-second penalty for changing in more than one direction while defending, which gave him that 5-second penalty, which dropped him back from that 10th position, that point position, back down to that 12th position. So before that, I think he was doing a decent job. Unfortunately, that kind of kicked in. I didn't actually see that event that was charged for that penalty, so I'm not sure how bad that was or if they were just getting really picky in this race for defending. Gabriel Bortoleto started off in 7th and ended up in 11th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 15, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Alonso for 14th on lap 17, passed Hülkenberg for 11th on lap 24, passed Kimi for 10th on lap 30, passed Ocon for 8th on lap 38. So a decent run from him, going up there and getting up into that 11th position, just outside the points in that regard. Not quite able to pull himself up into that point range, but it's still a decent run for him as he started off in, pretty decently as well in these last few races. So it's kind of a shame to see him, not quite get into the points for that stake F1 Sauber car as they switch to Audi next season. So we'll have to see how that Audi comes into play with those new engines that they're going to bring and the new format that they're going to have, to see if they can really do some development or if it's going to be a building season for them as they're coming into this season. This gets us to our top 10, where we find Lance Stroll, who started off in 15th and ended up in 10th. He did lose one spot at the very first race, the very first lap. So pretty good run for him, even though he lost a spot, getting up there into that 10th position. And he was actually a little ahead of that into that 9th position before getting a penalty. So a decent run for him, I think, overall. Did what he needed to do, try to get him up there, keep those Aston Martins where they were. So that was a pretty good run for him at the end of the season. He did have a one-stop race, stopping on lap 42, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums. So I pretty went that long stint on that very first stint with that hard tire before switching to a set of mediums. He did pass Sainz for 9th on lap 16, passed Lawson quite a bit in this scenario, where he passed Lawson for 5th on lap 18, passed Lawson for 6th on lap 21, passed Lawson for 7th on lap 22, passed Lawson for 16th on lap 45, passed Lawson for 17th on lap 47, passed Albon for 15th on lap 48, passed Hijar for 14th on lap 50, passed Kimi for 13th on lap 52, passed Yuki for 12th on lap 53, passed Sainz for 11th on lap 55, passed Behrman for 9th on lap 58, and of course he got that penalty again for changing more than one direction while defending, which I think they were getting kind of picky in this race, but I didn't get to see all of those instances. So we'll have to dive into it a little bit more if we want to dig into that. But again, he was having a really good race, and of course they were going that back and forth passing and repassing scenario, but working his way up into that 9th position before that penalty dropped him back down into the 10th. So a good run, I think, unusual, but a good run for Lance Stroll in this race. Nico Hülkenberg started off in 18th and ended up in 9th. He had a two-stop strategy, stopping on lap 7, switching from a set of softs to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to lap 42 before switching to a set of mediums. So he was like the other person, I think, in this field that started off on soft tires. He did pass Gasly for 18th on lap 2, passed Ocon for 12th on lap 29, had a black and white flag for track limits on lap 31, but didn't get a penalty, so he kept it within those boundaries from that point forward. He did pass Albon for 16th on lap 50, passed Hijar for 15th on lap 52, passed Kimi for 14th on lap 55, passed Yuki for 13th on lap 56, passed Sainz for 12th on lap 58, passed Borletto for 11th on lap 58, so near the end of the race. And of course, with those 2 5-second penalties from Stroll and Behrman, it kind of pushed him up from that 11th position up into that 9th position overall. So that was interesting to see at the very end, and he was kind of happy about that, even though he wasn't quite, expecting to be in that point position. He ended up in that point position, which is nice to see for that stake, car getting those position points at the very end of the season as well as they were kind of getting back into the rhythm of things after that pretty horrible start that they had. Lewis Hamilton started off in 16th and ended up in 8th. He gained 2 spots at the first lap, so a really good run for him. He had a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 8, switching from a set of softs to a set of hards, and then taking with a 2.4 second pit stop, taking that set of hards to lap 39 before switching to a set of mediums with a nice 2.1 second pit stop. He did pass Sainz for 13th on lap 2, passed Behrman for 12th on lap 4, passed Kimi for 8th on lap 24, had a black and white flag for track limits on lap 31, so didn't quite make that in that regard, but he didn't get that penalty, so he kind of kept it in the boundaries from that point forward. Passed Franco for 15th on lap 35, passed Gasly for 13th on lap 37, passed Hijar for 13th on lap 39, passed Sainz for 12th on lap 42, passed Hulkenberg for 11th on lap 43, passed Borletto for 9th on lap 44, and passed Behrman for 8th on lap 46. So he kind of worked his way up from that 16th position all the way up to that 8th position pretty much on his own, and a really good job, I think, for Lewis Hamilton. Unfortunately, he had that bad qualifying session, which put him back down to that 16th position, but he did work himself up into the points, which is good to see him kind of recovering again in that Ferrari. So hopefully next year when that new Ferrari comes out and they can work a little bit better, for him in that regard and have a better feel, so he can work better with his teammate in that regard and kind of move forward as we move into the new era. Esteban Ocon started off in 8th and ended up in 7th. He lost 1 spot at the very first race, so not the greatest start from him, but he kind of made that up, getting into that 7th position at the end. He did a 1-stop race, stopping on lap 19, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Hijar for 14th on lap 24, passed Hulkenberg for 12th on lap 29, passed Kimi for 11th on lap 32, passed Borletto for 8th on lap 38, and then had to repass him almost immediately again for 8th position for that 38th lap. So he had that little back and forth pass repass scenario at the very end, but he managed to pull out that 8th position and gonna get up there into that 7th because of those penalties and some other things that were kind of going on in that scenario with people dropping back out of that top 10 positions. Fernando Alonso did a really good job, I think. He started off in 6th and ended up in 6th, so he didn't kind of drop back into the field. Had a good qualifying session and into where he qualified from. But I think overall with that Aston Martin, this is a really good spot for them to get up there, really close to that top 5, but not holding out in that 6th position. He did gain a spot at the very first lap. Had a 1-stop strategy, stopping on lap 16, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, having a 4.1 second pit stop, so a pretty slow pit stop in that regard, but did pass Borletto for 14th on lap 17, passed Hulkenberg for 10th on lap 24, and passed Kimi for 9th on lap 27. So he did a little have action as well in that and did a decent job keeping it into that 6th position, getting some really good points for Aston Martin. George Russell started off in 4th and ended up in 5th. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap, so not the greatest start from him this one. But I think I did decent. I'm not sure if he was fighting some issue in that car or whatever, but he was kind of dropping back a little bit, but kind of maintaining that. So, I think a decent job from him overall, but not where he really wanted to put pressure on Lando and give Max potentially some breathing room in that regard, but that didn't quite play out for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 14, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.3 second pit stop. He did pass Alonso for 5th on lap 4, passed Kimi for 8th on lap 20, passed Stroll for 7th on lap 21, passed Lawson for 6th on lap 21, passed Yuki for 5th on lap 29. So a decent run from George Russell, but not quite where he wanted to be, putting a little bit more pressure on that third position overall instead of being back there into that 5th. Charles Leclerc did a pretty good job, I think, starting off in 5th and ended up in 4th, gaining one spot at the very first lap. Had a two-stop strategy, stopping on lap 16, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.5 second pit stop, and then going to lap 39 on that set of hards before switching back to a set of mediums with a 2.0 second pit stop. He did pass Kimi for 8th on lap 19, passed Stroll for 6th on lap 20, passed Lawson for 5th on lap 20, passed Yuki for 4th on lap 24, and passed Russell for 4th on lap 42. So again, I think he did a really good job of getting up there. He could put a little bit of pressure on Lando at the very beginning, and then kind of dropped back a little bit from that point on, but still maintained that 4th position overall. So I think a decent job for him in that Ferrari as they were coming back out of a pretty poor race, a couple of races in that regard. So I think that kind of helps them in that momentum, in that mindset of moving forward into the next season. This gets us to Lando Norris, who started off in 2nd and ended up in 3rd. He did lose one spot at the very first lap, and he had a two-stop strategy, kind of mimicking Charles Leclerc to try to cut him off, stopping on lap 16, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.1 second pit stop, so a good pit stop from there. Taking that set of hards to lap 40, where he switched to a set of mediums with a 2.4 second pit stop. He did pass Kimi for 8th on lap 18, passed Sainz for 7th on lap 18, passed Stroll for 6th on lap 19, passed Lawson for 5th on lap 19, and then almost had to repass him immediately there for 5th on lap 19 as well. And they made it to Yuki for 3rd on position on lap 23. And that was kind of where that incident happened, where he kind of cut the edge. And according to the announcers, he went off the track doing that. But then the stewards kind of gave in and said basically that was because of Yuki's erratic driving, kind of weaving a little bit, and kind of pushed him off the track. So they didn't give Lando a penalty for going off the track and passing, but they gave it to Yuki instead. So I think more along it would have been a racing incident, and they could have not necessarily penalized either of them in that regard, but that was kind of my viewpoint. So I think overall, Lando did what he needed. He kind of maintained this race in that 3rd position after he got passed by his teammate and just kind of stayed there, but he didn't really have to put any pressure on his teammate because he knew he was going to win that championship in that 3rd, but was able to manage the race between him and Charles Leclerc fairly well, keeping Charles behind in that regard, making sure that he could get that 3rd position at the end. Oscar Piastri started off in 3rd and ended up in 2nd. He did gain one spot at the very first lap. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 41 on a set of hards. So he set that set of hards and went long to that lap 41 marker before switching to a set of mediums with a nice 2.2 second pit stop. As I said, he had a good start at the very beginning, keeping in 3rd on that set of hard tires, which I was kind of expecting him to drop back a little bit in that, but instead he was able to maintain that 3rd position fairly easily. And then he passed Lando for 2nd on lap 1, gaining that 2nd position, and then kind of maintaining that position and going long and managing his race against Max to see if he could potentially regain that 1st position from Max in that regard, but was never able to really put any kind of super hard pressure on Max. It did make him a little bit stressed in that regard, where he couldn't easily change his strategy and try to mix things up a little bit more. So I think it kind of locked Max into his strategy by one stop, and that kind of played into this race where he couldn't really back up the field too easily because of the mixture on the McLaren strategies, and Oscar kind of keeping in that realm and not gaining that position where he would have to drop behind and then regain those positions and risk not being able to do that. So I think overall, Oscar played that role. I know he's kind of disappointed in that front side where he was kind of got back out there after his pit stop saying, well, what do I need to do to win this? And then given the time frame that he needed, and I think that kind of set in he did gain, that shrink that gap quite a bit, but not quite near enough that he needed to really put pressure on Max. But again, a good run from Oscar. This gets us to our race winner, Max Verstappen, who started off in first and ended up in first. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 23, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.3 second pit stop. He had a really good start, chopping off, keeping the lead, getting out there, getting what he needed to do to get in that clean air to really run with it. And he did pass Oscar for first on lap 41 after, he had pitted and kind of caught back up to Oscar and then pitted him while Oscar was going really long on that first stint. So overall, I think Max did all he could. I think he pushed out as much as he could. I know there was some talk about trying to back up the field a little bit. And I think maybe early on that was an option, but I think he was trying to just break the gaps there to be able to have a easy pit stop, which that didn't ever play out in this run. So I think that strategy for him might have backfired a little bit instead of trying to back up the field and push, Lando behind a couple of the other drivers like Charles Leclerc or George Russell. And I think they were truly looking for George Russell because he was doing so well in the, practice sessions in the qualifying in that sense scenario, but it didn't quite play out. But when Charles Leclerc was on his tail, I figured that would be the play there, is to push him back behind Charles Leclerc. But they didn't choose that option. Instead, they tried to, break the field, get the gaps, do what he needed to do to get first. And in that regard, he did well. I think maybe this second thought of the strategy may have played into him for once in that Red Bull scenario. But he did what he needed. Good run for him. To give you a quick rundown of how this race went, we basically see here in lap 5, it was a 2.2 second lead for Max over Oscar. By lap 10, it was a 2.21 second lead for Max over Oscar. So Oscar is kind of maintaining that gap or shrinking that gap a little bit. By lap 15, it was down to a 1.64 second lead for Max over Oscar. By lap 25, when Max decided to pit, it was an 18.27 second lead for Oscar over Max. By lap 29, the halfway point, it was a 14.53 second lead for Oscar over Max. By lap 35, it was down to a 7.45 second lead for Oscar over Max. You can see Max was coming back. And then by lap 45, it was a 22.2 second lead for Max over Oscar because Oscar got passed and then he had to pit. And so that pushed him back, but then he started coming back in the field. By lap 52, it was down to a 17.28 second lead for Max over Oscar. And by the end of the race at lap 58, it was down to a 12.59 second lead for Max over Oscar. So again, not the pressure we wanted to see Oscar on Max, but it kept Max honest where he couldn't really go for a different strategy in that regard. So for our little gap graphs here for between drivers and their laps, I kind of chose this point where this is right as Max pitted the very first time. And so he was kind of up there with that 0 marker with Piastri at 2 seconds behind him. And then, of course, Lando down in that 3rd position ahead of Charles Leclerc, kind of coming up through that ranking. But Max coming out again ahead of them, but behind Oscar in that regard. So it kind of put more pressure on Oscar, and keeping Lando in that mix was just there for scenarios, because Lando knew he just needed to be 3rd. He didn't really need to put any risk involved in trying to overtake Max, and kind of hammering that out in that regard. So we can see where this is right after Lando's 2nd pit stop, and so this was kind of just interesting in that regard. So Lando kind of pitted in there, and then Oscar just did his 1st pit stop in that regard as well. So you could see the Max is coming out there quite a bit in the lead, and then you have Lando in there with a 2nd pit stop, kind of gaining some ground on his teammate, but then pitting, and then his teammate was pitting right after him in that 2nd lap. And of course, Charles Leclerc was the one that kind of triggered some of that with his pit stop. So he was right there in front of Lando in that regard. So that kind of came out, kind of, those even gaps, before and afterwards, maybe a little bit of shrink, but not terribly. But you gave Max that nice big lead. And then, of course, by the end, Max had a nice, huge lead in that regard, ahead of his team, Piastri, and then Lando's, was right kind of behind him. Not too bad with Charles Leclerc dropping back a little bit farther. So what did this do to our Drivers' Championship? Of course, we have Lando winning the World Championship for the F1 Drivers' Championship in this race, now with 423 points over Max's 421. So just 2 points difference between the two that could have thrown out everything into a loop with a couple of different scenarios. But unfortunately for Lando, he was able to maintain that third position and eke out the win for the Drivers' Championship. Oscar is not too far behind with 410. George Russell drops back to a little bit in that fourth position with 319. Charles Leclerc with 242, and Lewis Hamilton's 156. What we see here is Fernando Alonso jumping up to that 10th position with 56 points, as he came in that top 10 positions, jumping over Isaac Hydjar and Nico Hulkenberg, but Nico Hulkenberg was able to get a couple points and maintain that 11th position, and Isaac Hydjar just dropped down to that 12th position. We also see Esteban Ocon jumping over Lance Stroll and Yuki in that scenario. So they both moved up where Yuki dropped down into that 17th position overall. So that kind of gives you a nice rundown of how things played out, with Jack Doohan and Franco the only people that did not actually score points this season. So did this actually change the constructor standing at all? No, it did not. It was able to maintain that position throughout this scenario. McLaren, of course, won it in Singapore, and they ended up with 833 points over the second place winner for Mercedes, who had 469. Red Bull was kind of gaining some ground there with 451 points, with Max Verstappen being the majority of those point runners. So it's kind of amazing to see how that played out, as we had one driver versus two drivers for the other teams. Ferrari's in there with 398, and Williams maintained that 137 points. And of course, we had a little bit of points gained from Aston Martin, bumping them up to 89, and Haas with 79. Keeping Kick Sauber in that 9th position, and Alpine with that 22 in that 10th position. So what is coming up next for me? I will try to do a deep dive into the season for Alpine, kind of going through the drivers and kind of comparing them to each other and how well they did, where they started, where they ended, for each, how many races, and what the averages are for those kind of aspects, and kind of compare those to the drivers around them in the Drivers' Championship as well, to kind of give you a feel of how well they did against the other teams that were close to being around them in these championships. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.